Thank you, Dr. Waters, for that very generous introduction. I will try to live up to it in the next 45 minutes or so. I also want to thank the Dean, the President, and the Board of Trustees for the opportunity to take the sabbatical. It's a wonderful time to start on a new project and to really feel again that thrill of new discovery and research and to get a little rest as well. I also wanted to thank my faculty colleagues. I feel very, very blessed to be here, and it's a wonderful place for me to land. It's been a very supportive faculty, and I think one of the ways that we support each other is by allowing each other to go on sabbatical and protecting that time. So thank you also for, in addition to all the other ways that you've supported me, for covering my responsibilities while I was gone. Now to the 16th century. If you were paying attention last fall to church media outlets and even some regular media outlets, you might know that 2017 was a significant Reformation anniversary. October of 2017 marked the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther's 95 Theses, the writing that began the firestorm that began the Reformation. I followed the media coverage of this event quite closely, always interested in how my specialty is viewed and utilized. The story of Luther needed to be told succinctly, of course, and to do that, reporters needed to stick to key plot points. So in most of these stories, the Reformation was described from a pretty traditional angle of Luther's new ideas and his conflict with authorities. I understand why the media took this approach, but I was struck once again by the ways that the traditional story of Luther's Reformation contains high drama, but few characters. We hear about the debates in which Luther aired his views, his excommunication, and his refusal to recant at the Diet of Worms. In all of these events, Luther was the focus, while his opponents played the supporting roles. The full story is more complicated than that, of course, but it is also more interesting. Luther was not a solitary, heroic figure standing alone against a monolithic medieval church. In fact, much of the last 40 years of Reformation history has explored how he and other reformers stood on the shoulders of a long line of late medieval reformers. Luther's ideas gained a following in part because he spoke to a larger trend in the late medieval church, an emphasis on reform. In the Reformation anniversary year, Catholic media outlets reported on this aspect of the Reformation, almost always as a way of saying, hey, we had reform too, and it was both before and after the Protestants had it. But it was rarely mentioned by other sources. So that's just a note to say that's one aspect of the narrative that I think is missing, and you'll note that in what I talk about today, you'll hear me mention again and again that the reformers often utilized ideas and initiatives that began in the late Middle Ages. Luther did differ from late medieval reformers in some significant ways, but perhaps the most important difference in terms of his influence was that he had the support of his prince, Frederick the Wise. This meant that he wasn't burned at the stake like many other reformers, which is always helpful for starting a movement, but also that he had the resources of a small kingdom at his disposal. One of the main resources Luther had was a faculty of colleagues at the University of Wittenberg, most of whom agreed with him on the major points of his theology, at least early on. In the 1530s, several disputes break out between the Wittenberg reformers, and that's been the focus of most of the research on Wittenberg faculty because, as reality TV shows us, conflict is more interesting than people getting along and cooperating and doing mundane things. So for this first decade plus of the Reformation movement, there was general agreement among the Wittenberg reformers. So Luther was not a solitary reformer toiling by himself. In fact, his colleagues in Wittenberg are the true supporting cast in the story of Luther. The early Reformation was so chaotic that it's hard for historians to delineate the many influences at play. But it is clear that Martin Luther and his colleagues played an outsized role in advising those who were interested in or caught up in the winds of change. The university, of course, attracted laity and aspiring pastors to its course of study and trained them in the new theology. Many of their students were from outside of the Wittenberg area and even outside of Germany, and when they went back home, then they often instituted reforms. The Wittenberg faculty also corresponded with interested parties and became a center of public discussion of unclear or debated points. In short, the Wittenberg faculty became a resource for people throughout Europe who were interested in the new teachings. The faculty also embarked on several other initiatives and in many different directions. They revised the university curriculum to better train both pastors and lay people, and they published pamphlets that explained their theology and practice. They also reorganized poverty relief measures, opened new public schools, wrote hymns, and helped cities and territories build the institutions that would support the long-term flourishing of the church. Finally, toward the end of the wild 1520s, they planned and executed visitations to some areas that had adopted the Reformation in order to see how the new churches and communities were doing. Now, I feel the need to add that they managed to do all of this not only because they were capable and motivated, but also because they had very light teaching loads, the equivalent of about one class a semester. For larger consulting types of projects like the visitations, too, they often took leave from their teaching for a semester or a year, sometimes 2 years. So they were remarkable, but still human. The many roles of the Wittenberg faculty were especially important throughout the 1520s, when Luther had been excommunicated and declared an outlaw. By these same declarations, the movement he started was deemed illegal, yet it was growing rapidly and taking on various forms. While much of its energy fed on the creativity of local movements, it sometimes suffered because it lacked the institutions and common practices that give movement stability. Meanwhile, Luther was locked away in the Wartburg Castle for almost a year, and even after he returned to Wittenberg in 1522, he could not travel outside of Saxony because of the imperial ban. So whether other faculty members wanted to lead this new movement or not, the movement needed leadership, and they stepped up to the task. The various initiatives of the Wittenberg faculty that I'll be discussing today all began in these delicate early years of the 1520s. The University of Wittenberg was a very unique resource in those early years of the Reformation, because the other cities that were early adopters of the Reformation did not have universities. In fact, later in the Reformation, several new academies were founded as training schools for Protestant youth and Protestant pastors, which then later evolved into universities. So major examples of this that still exist today are Geneva, Strasbourg, and Zurich. All began as these sort of schools for training Protestants. One of the most important ways the University of Wittenberg shaped the Reformation, of course, was in its role as a training center for Protestant pastors and other civic leaders. As it turns out, one of the first reform efforts of the faculty at Wittenberg was a series of curriculum revisions. Now, I didn't advertise this aspect of my lecture because curriculum revisions is not the stuff of exciting lectures, and I wanted people to come. Yet I think it is helpful to realize that throughout the ages, what is taught to students has been debated and has changed. And I'll try to keep this section of the lecture short and less painful than it might otherwise be. All right, the University of Wittenberg had been founded in 1502, just 15 years before Luther's 95 Theses. It was a small university, and perhaps because of this, it was open to new experiments. Even before Luther joined the faculty in 1512, a number of Wittenberg scholars were committed to the ideals of humanism. At that time, humanism was an educational program that had begun in Italy and was influential north of the Alps. In Italy, the term humanist was used to describe independent tutors and teachers on the fringes of most universities, who emphasized the study of rhetoric, poetry, moral philosophy, and history. They minimized the scholastic study of logic, criticized, I guess is another way of saying it, which dominated most universities at that time, but instead focused on good letters, that is, good writing and good speaking. Meanwhile, their interest in languages and history led them to emphasize the original versions of texts instead of the compendia of excerpts from various authors on a given topic. Their interest in original texts had two important upshots for the Reformation. First, an emphasis on the study of Scripture, especially the Greek and Hebrew texts, and second, an emphasis on the study of rhetoric, which dovetailed with the Reformers' enthusiasm for preaching. By 1517, the same year as the 95 Theses, Luther and others began advocating for curricular revision at the university. This revision was not purely theological, despite the fact that it began in the same year as the 95 Theses. Instead, this is one example of how the goals of late medieval humanism and the goals of the Reform movement overlapped. And the 1517 revision added new faculty positions in Greek and Hebrew, introduced the study of rhetoric, and added lectures on the Bible and Augustine. In 1517, these were simply additions to the curriculum. The traditional courses of the scholastic curriculum were left in place, although those classes quickly declined in popularity as Wittenberg attracted students who were interested in the new initiatives. One upshot of the 1517 reforms was that the University of Wittenberg hired Philip Melanchthon to teach Greek. Melanchthon soon became one of Luther's closest colleagues, and himself a prominent figure in the new Reformation movement. It was Melanchthon who would take up the unofficial leadership of Lutheranism after Luther had died. One of Melanchthon's many contributions to the movement was another curriculum reform just 5 years later, in 1523, when he became rector. These reforms included 2 new professorships in rhetoric, so again emphasizing this speaking aspect, as well as the institution of regular declamations, or persuasive speeches. These speeches were meant as an alternative to the scholastic disputations that were standard academic practice. So these 2 changes were an attempt to improve student speaking and preaching. The faculty statutes in 1523, however, had also quite a bit to do with discipline and the basic oversight of students. This was likely a response to the influx of new students to Wittenberg, and it also was a reflection of the humanist emphasis on order. The new statutes included a type of admissions process, as well as an advisor system. Students were to have an interview with the rector to be sure they were capable of the course of study. The rector would then introduce them to a teacher who could recommend the course of study, quote, so that they do not cast it out aimlessly. So that's a goal for advisors. Finally, the new statutes introduced some laws on the character of youth. These concern students' dress and behavior, specifically forbidding vandalizing, marauding, associating with prostitutes, and disturbing the public peace. They covered all their bases. Transgressions of this kind would be punished according to imperial law, exactly as they would be by the state, except that the rector himself would carry out the punishments. Another set of curricular reforms, I'm almost done with curricular reforms. Another set of curricular reforms was instituted in 1526, also under Melanchthon's leadership. These revisions established classical languages and literature as the basis for all studies in the arts. The statutes argue that subjects must be studied in a proper sequence in order for the higher studies to be properly understood. So now, for the first time, the curriculum revisions force students to take particular classes versus simply offering new classes. The 1526 statutes were also the first to mention future ministers by name. They maintained that pastors needed a classics background, especially in orations, to properly carry out their work. We see here again the linking of humanist learning and Reformation concerns, and that linkage remained in future reforms in the 1530s and beyond. Curricular revision continued at regular intervals as they navigated the new waters of the Reformation. The early curricular revisions that I just summarized were not revolutionary. Despite the bewildering pace of change in the Reformation movement, the Wittenberg reformers didn't change the required course of study until 9 years into the movement. Instead, the changes they made were incremental, and their provisions mostly supported new courses and the practice of orations. I've been mulling over the apparent disconnect between their slow curricular change and the rate at which things were changing outside of the university, and I'm still not quite sure what to make of it. The Lutheran reformers were cautious in some other ways, but in many ways they were not afraid to take a new path. So that's something I'm still trying to figure out. At any rate, the curricular changes met an immediate need: the training of new laity and new pastors to lead communities that had instituted the Reformation. Despite an increase in students enrolled at Wittenberg, there was a persistent lack of qualified Lutheran pastors for several decades. In fact, in nearly every region that instituted the Reformation, Lutheran and otherwise, local leaders complained that they couldn't find qualified pastors. This clergy shortage also became a problem for Catholics, and it was addressed in their own Reformation. In fact, one upshot of the Catholic Reformation was the founding of special schools known as seminaries, which were to train clergy under the direction of the bishop. The Council of Trent in 1563 mandated that a seminary be opened in every diocese so that more clergy might be recruited and trained. The term seminary was a new Latin term at the time, and understood literally, it meant plot for sowing seeds, or a seed bed. Some Catholic clergy continued to be trained at the university, but the diocesan model of the Catholic seminaries has continued to this day, and of course it's a model that Protestants came to appreciate as well. Aside from university students, there were many more new Protestants, both clergy and lay, who could not study at Wittenberg. The Wittenberg faculty helped catechize these people by writing short, practical guides to major beliefs and practices. They used the relatively new medium of the printing press to do this, as did all parties involved in Reformation disputes. The printing press allowed for the inexpensive distribution of ideas, especially via pamphlets, which were the cheap supermarket paperbacks of the day. My previous research has focused on early pamphlets by Luther that outlined the practical changes he advocated. Many of his fellow professors at Wittenberg engaged in the same pursuit, particularly as they saw the need and as Luther became busy with administrative matters. This was essentially a form of continuing education via helpful pamphlets. Continuing education was especially necessary for the many pastors who began their careers as Catholic priests. A priest who became convinced by Protestant arguments might change his affiliation, but he was not likely to retrain as a Protestant minister for many of the same reasons that make retraining in anything difficult today. Instead, these new Protestant pastors simply began to lead their parishes as they saw fit. Other new Protestant pastors gained their position not by a conscientious decision, but instead because their congregation or their region had adopted the Reformation, and they were either neutral on the issue or wanted to keep their jobs. These pastors, too, needed instruction on how to faithfully carry out their responsibilities. For the first generation of the Reformation, at least, reformers were willing to provide these clergy on-the-job training by publishing resources on their most important tasks. Most clergy in the 16th century had little to no university training, and very few could read Latin. So some of the same resources written for German-speaking lay people were also beneficial to clergy. Writings on the Mass or liturgy, for example, were of equal interest to both pastors and lay people, since in the new Protestant understanding, the pastor and the people were engaged in one communal act of worship. Pastors needed a few more details on what to do and what not to do, but both groups needed a basic orientation to worship in the sacraments. Guides to Protestant worship were a popular genre among the Wittenberg theologians of the 1520s. Luther wrote several, as did Johannes Bugenhagen, a faculty member and pastor at the town church, whom you'll hear a lot more about later. And the liaison between the university and the prince's court, Georg Spalatin, also wrote a pamphlet entitled, quote, How to Abolish Unchristian Practices and to Establish Christian Ones. I love their blunt titles, pulling no punches. The most common publishing endeavor by the Wittenberg faculty, however, was to aid new Protestants in their understanding of Scripture and new pastors in their preaching. In the Protestant model, lay people were to read and understand Scripture, and pastors had a particular task of preaching on Scripture. Since these were fairly new endeavors, many of the Wittenberg faculty members' writings were either biblical commentaries or sermon helps. Each of the 5 or 6 most prominent members of the theological faculty wrote commentaries, so many that I haven't even cataloged them all yet. Some of these commentaries are publications of the lectures they gave on biblical books as part of their teaching responsibilities, and others are shorter overviews of biblical books. It might not surprise you to hear that the Pauline epistles were the most common subject of these commentaries, although several of the faculty members wrote commentaries on the Psalms, and both Bugenhagen and Johann Agricola wrote commentaries on the Gospel of Luke. Wittenberg faculty also published collections of sermons and volumes of sermon helps to assist pastors who struggled with their new responsibility of expounding on biblical texts. Preaching the Protestant way meant abandoning the traditional fourfold meaning of Scripture, which posited that each biblical text contained a literal meaning, an allegorical meaning, a moral meaning, and an eschatological meaning. While Protestant exegetical methods were not fully developed, the Wittenberg reformers taught Christians to keep biblical interpretation simple, or as simple as you could keep it, by focusing on the historical meaning of the text and listening for what God might be saying to them through the text. Protestant preachers were to focus on instructing and exhorting their listeners, relying on the Holy Spirit to assist them. This proved to be a difficult task, and many preachers needed more help than the Holy Spirit seemed to give. Philip Melanchthon tried to help by publishing several guides to the art of rhetoric, once again drawing on his humanist roots. In 1522, Luther published a volume of his own Christmas and Advent sermons to offer inspiration, or, if necessary, to provide solid texts that the weakest preachers could just read aloud. In 1525, he followed that up with another volume of sermons on Lent. Luther continued to publish sermon collections occasionally throughout his life. Another form of sermon aid was pioneered by Wittenberg faculty members Johannes Bugenhagen and by Dietrich. These were called summaries, and they contained both general instructions on preaching and ideas for specific sermons. These summaries and sermon collections eased Protestant preachers into the daunting task of exhorting their flocks. I've mentioned several times that the Wittenberg reformers were often standing on the shoulders of late medieval reformers, or that the Catholic Reformation carried out similar initiatives. But one of the truly innovative things that the Wittenberg reformers did was to introduce communal hymn singing as part of worship. In the Middle Ages, the liturgy was sung and spoken by the priest and the choir up front, all in Latin. Laity participated in the service, but by praying separately and individually as the priest and the choir worshiped up front. So essentially, worship was two different but interrelated experiences. Luther and later Protestants changed worship so that everyone was participating in the same service. And one way to do that, clearly, was to have worshipers and clergy singing hymns together. Luther led this innovation out of the conviction that hymns would foster communal solidarity in worship, as well as teach the Bible and Christian faith through song. But he also cited music's emotional power. He thought it healed the soul and raised the spirits, and he even surmised that it could drive away the devil. Fortunately, he also possessed a significant talent and interest in music. The preface to his first revision of the Mass in 1523 mentioned a need for German hymns and musical versions of the Psalms. Shortly thereafter, he set out to meet that need by assigning 9 psalms to 3 different colleagues in Wittenberg, and he wrote one himself. He focused his energies on the writing of chorales. So within a year, he had composed 24 chorales, and other Wittenberg figures added another 15 or so. The most prolific Wittenberg hymn writer after Luther was Paul Speratus, who had fled to Wittenberg after being imprisoned for his Protestant convictions. He happened to be a gifted composer, and he happened to be in Wittenberg in 1523 to 1524, the exact time that Luther was organizing musical resources for the church. While he was not a member of the Wittenberg faculty, he was taken into their circle during a short time in Wittenberg. The very first Protestant hymn book was published in 1524 and was called the Book of 8 Songs. I'm guessing that they brought it out so quickly they didn't have time to find another name for it. So as you might guess, it contained 8 songs, 5 by Luther and 3 by Speratus. Later that same year, so again in 1524, an expanded version was published with 26 hymns, 18 of which were by Luther. One of the hymns in that book, in fact, was by Elizabeth Cruciger, who was the wife of Wittenberg faculty member Caspar Cruciger. That hymn made her the first female Lutheran hymn writer, and it is still in most Lutheran hymnals, although throughout its history it was often attributed to a man. Hymn singing became a German Lutheran cultural phenomenon. Reformers encouraged the people to sing hymns at home and in schools. Some churches even had a hymn sing before the worship service, as well as hymns sung during the service. In addition to instructing and lifting spirits, the hymn served as a bridge between different classes of people because they were popular across classes, laity and clergy, the literate and the illiterate, those who knew Latin and those who did not. We get a sense of this phenomenon from the historian Christopher Brown, who wrote a fabulous book on hymn singing in the town of Joachimsthal. In Joachimsthal, the pastor and church musician promoted hymn singing, and the laity took to it with enthusiasm. Choral students paraded in the streets singing hymns twice a week, and families sang hymns often at home. In the 17th century, when the town of Joachimsthal came under Catholic rule, Lutheranism survived underground for at least a generation, largely because of hymn singing at home. Both their identity and convictions as Lutherans had been formed in large part by their hymn traditions. A larger set of Wittenberg faculty were involved in another broader educational initiative. By the mid-1520s, they began advocating for the establishment of public schools for children. Before then, various types of schools existed in different places. Monastic schools were probably the most common, and they were organized and run by monasteries or convents. The main churches in larger cities often ran schools based in their churches. There were also guild schools organized by the various artisan guilds as a benefit for their children. And of course, the wealthiest citizens educated their children by hiring private tutors, but that was a fairly limited number. Luther encouraged rulers who had implemented the Reformation to open schools in their territories, but he was frustrated by their disinterest, that they were much more interested in building up roads and bridges and armies than in the lowly task of educating children. So in 1524, he took his plea to the public with a pamphlet called "To the Councilmen of all cities in Germany, that they establish and maintain Christian schools." He was appealing to the many independent cities in Germany that could decide whether and how to implement the Reformation. Some cities at this time already supported local schools, but Luther wanted to see that practice spread. In addition to governments that were apathetic to public education, he was arguing against 2 groups of people. First, those who thought that only clergy or monks needed an education, And second, those who argued that because the Holy Spirit would enlighten people directly, education was unnecessary. Against these arguments, Luther responded that the increase in education had opened up the Bible through the study of ancient languages, and that the world was only beginning to see the benefits of that study. He also argued that education contributes to the common good of society by creating learned citizens. He maintained that even the richest city cannot be safe or prosperous if fools have control of the city's resources. Education then helps to protect the welfare of the city by creating wise and honorable citizens. He also makes a wonderful argument for the study of history and the arts that I'm compelled to quote directly. He writes, quote, "If children were instructed and trained in schools and learned languages, the other arts, and history, they would then hear of the doings and sayings of the entire world and how things went with various cities, kingdoms, princes, men, and women. Thus they could, in a short time, see before themselves, as in a mirror, the character, life, counsel, and purposes of a whole world from the beginning, successful and unsuccessful. On this basis, they could then draw the proper inferences, and in the fear of God, take their own place in the stream of human events. In addition, they could gain from history the knowledge and understanding of what to seek and what to avoid in this outward life, and be able to advise and direct others accordingly. The training we acquire at home, apart from such schools, will make us wise through our own experience. But before that can be accomplished, we will be dead 100 times over, and will have acted rashly throughout our mortal life. For it takes a long time to acquire personal experience." End quote. I quote this not only because I like the quote, but also because I've maintained for years that history offers vicarious life experience and can even offer wisdom. And I thought it was basically my own idea. So one of the things that came from my sabbatical was the chance to reread this text, and I realized that I probably got the idea here. So I wanted to give credit where credit's due. Luther's specific proposal suggested a broadly humanist curriculum with a focus on the classical languages of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, as well as the liberal arts. These proposals were not original by any means, but Luther and his colleagues took their advocacy for education to a new level in two ways. First, by calling for compulsory public education, and second, by calling for the education of girls as well as boys. Luther anticipated parents' objections that children were needed to help around the house or the farm. To counter this, he argued that they could be spared for 1 or 2 hours a day to get an education. He also tried to motivate parents to provide education for their children because it was in the child's best interest. In case that didn't work, he added that it was their duty, commanded by God, to educate their children, and that they would be held accountable for that duty. Luther saw education of the young as a responsibility of all adults. He put this rather bluntly by saying, quote, "For what other purpose do the older folks exist other than to care for, instruct, and bring up the young?" Already in 1524, the same year that he wrote this work, 4 cities adopted school reforms along the line of Luther's vision, and many more cities followed in subsequent years. In 1528, his colleague Philip Melanchthon planned out a detailed curriculum for the new schools near Wittenberg, and this curriculum became influential for schools throughout Germany. Melanchthon also published numerous works on pedagogy so that cities would continue to place a priority on education and teachers would know how to carry out their tasks. The rest of the Wittenberg faculty played a role in the establishment of public schools as well. Some of them even left Wittenberg to lead these new schools. Luther's old friend and colleague Nicholas von Arnstorff went to Magdeburg to head one of the first schools and to pastor a congregation. And Caspar Cruciger, whose wife wrote the first hymn by a woman, first Protestant hymn by a woman, I should say. So Caspar Cruciger went to another Magdeburg school a year later. Johann Agricola, a lecturer in Bible, became the rector in Eisladen's new school. And Joachim Camerarius went to Nuremberg to lead their new school. It's a testament to the faculty's commitment to these schools that they were willing to leave their own positions, at least temporarily, to make sure they got to a good start. Another urgent matter for the Wittenberg faculty was to reform the system of poor relief. Due to a number of economic and agricultural factors, poverty was on the rise significantly in the 16th century. As with so many of these issues, the late medieval churches had also attempted to reform poor relief, so this is another example in which Protestant reformers picked up a strand of reform that had begun earlier. Significant theological difference, however, meant that Catholics and Protestants went about their reforms in poor relief in different ways. The medieval practice of charity was dominated by begging. Beggars on the street were seen as reminders that we are all beggars before God, wholly dependent on God's mercy. In this vein, late medieval mendicant orders also begged in the streets, ostensibly on behalf of the poor. The word mendicant means begging and includes the Franciscans, Dominicans, and then some Augustinians. When some mendicant chapters became wealthy through a combination of begging and land holdings, they aroused resentment by citizens toward all beggars. The act of giving alms to a beggar also had theological meaning for the Christians who gave the alms. Because giving alms was one of three main good works, the others being fasting and prayer, and because those good works were considered salvific in the Middle Ages, financially comfortable Christians needed to have beggars or other poor to whom they could donate. This was especially true for the wealthy, who were always a bit concerned about Jesus' statement that it would be easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter heaven. For them, giving to the poor helped offset the spiritual burden of being wealthy. Luther and his colleagues found this system of almsgiving to be disingenuous, since those who gave alms were tempted to give for their own spiritual benefit rather than for love of the beggar. Furthermore, the Wittenbergs thought that it was immoral to use the poor as an object of charity. They thought that late medieval theology incentivized keeping the poor down so that there would always be objects of charity for believers in need of religious merit. The Wittenberg professor and Luther's Dr. Vater, Andreas Karlstadt, wrote a treaty in 1522 called That There Should Be No Beggars Among Christians, which outlined this rationale for their changes. Protestant towns and territories took swift action to centralize poor relief services and to outlaw begging. This is another arena in which humanist and Protestant ideology overlapped. Humanists had the ideal of an ordered and peaceful civic community, and they were motivated to reform poor relief in order to promote this order. Protestants shared this desire for a peaceful civic life, but in the name of Christian community and love of the neighbor. In addition, the decline of monasteries and convents in Protestant cities meant that the services those communities offered to the poor were often no longer available. So in the midst of all the changes, in a town switching over to Protestantism, the needs of the poor were even more urgent than they were before the Reformation. Wittenberg reformers attempted to meet these needs by establishing a common chest under the control of the town council. All services for the poor were funded through that chest. Wittenberg was the first city to adopt this model already in 1522, and several others followed quickly thereafter. Most cities collected funds weekly and kept them in a chest with 3 or 4 different locks. Funds from the chest were distributed to individuals according to need. An administrator was appointed for each part of town on the theory that they would know the needs of their own neighborhood. These administrators would then meet to discuss needs in their community and to decide how to allocate aid. And when decisions had been reached, the 3 or 4 administrators who had keys to the chest then all opened them and began distributions. The common chest also supported other poor relief measures besides monetary gifts. Health care for the poor was often paid out of the chest, and many communities hired a designated physician to care for the poor. Healthcare was another need that the monastic communities had filled in the Middle Ages, so it was another new hole in the system that Protestants had to fill. Common chest funds were also used to support people in vocational training and to offer loans so that workers could start or maintain a business. The idea was that a centralized system would prevent people from falling through the cracks of a patchwork system and would create a cohesive, supportive community. It also meant, however, that more power was centralized into a church-state alliance, and that those who were on the outskirts of the community for whatever reason could often not find the aid that they might have received in a less systemic patchwork system. Whatever the weaknesses of this system, it's noteworthy that Germany and Scandinavian Lutheran countries are still known for their strong welfare systems, so this was an idea that had significant influence over the years. Less colorful, perhaps, but no less important, was the institution of church orders, sometimes called church ordinances, to set forth the teaching, practices, and the structure of new churches in each territory. This work, too, often fell to the Wittenberg faculty. If you know something about the Methodist Book of Discipline or the Reformed and Presbyterian Books of Order, the 16th century church orders might sound familiar. They typically included basic doctrinal statements, liturgical guides, regulations for schools and universities, and policies for poor relief. They also outline the church hierarchy and procedures for enacting discipline within that hierarchy, which of course is everyone's favorite part of these sorts of books. As it often happens, the motivation to write these orders came from a brush with disorder, namely the Peasants' Revolt and the rise of other radical movements in the mid-1520s. These first-generation Wittenberg reformers were particularly sensitive to the danger of disorder, because many critics of Reformed argued that their movement would lead to chaos. So they were extra motivated to help bring guidance and order to the new Reformed territories by writing these rather laborious texts, and they did it so well that they were often asked to write orders for multiple territories. 3 faculty members at Wittenberg wrote more than 15 church orders in total, but the most prolific author of church orders was the pastor of the Wittenberg Town Church and university faculty member Johannes Bugenhagen, who wrote or co-wrote 8 church orders. In fact, he is responsible for the successful establishment of Lutheranism in much of northern Germany and in all of Denmark. Keep in mind, this was the guy who taught at the University of Wittenberg, pastored a church in town, published a lot of sermonades and pioneered this new form, as well as writing biblical commentaries and pastoral works, so he was a busy guy. One reason that he was in demand in northern Germany is that he was a native of Pomerania, and he spoke the Low German dialect that was similar to the dialects of the other northern areas. Bugenhagen also had great administrative abilities, and these abilities gained him enough renown that he was asked to help implement the Reformation in Denmark when, in 1537, a new king decided to make his kingdom Lutheran. King Christian III had been in regular contact with Luther, Melanchthon, and Bugenhagen for years, and Christian had decided that he wanted the Wittenberg form of reform for his kingdom when he ascended to the throne. Christian ensured that he would get this not only by employing Bugenhagen to author the church orders, but also by naming several bishops who had studied at Wittenberg. So you see again that influence spreading out. Not content to simply run all of these experiments, the Wittenberg faculty also tried to engage the effects of their efforts. Essentially, they conducted assessments to determine if their initiatives had been effective, which means, of course, that both curriculum revision and assessments are thoroughly Protestant practices. So we can feel pretty good about ourselves this year. The most formal of these assessments was a practice of parish visitations. This was a traditional church practice in which authorities visited a town or village to observe church and civic life. But it happened only sporadically in the Middle Ages. The revival of church visitations was another proposal of late medieval reformers that was taken up by Wittenberg reformers. The initiative for these visitations came from the Wittenberg faculty. One motivation for the visitations, interestingly enough, was the fact that churches were having a hard time getting laity to donate to the church, now that monetary offerings were not considered a meritorious work that helped gain salvation. The very harsh upshot of this theological shift is that Protestant pastors were not getting paid. Not only was this inconvenient for the pastors, but it also threatened the stability of the new church. So in 1528, Philip Melanchthon composed instructions to the visiting inspectors, and a visitation was begun in Saxony, the territory in which Wittenberg was located. The territory was divided, and teams of visitors visited each parish within it. Each team contained at least one member of the Wittenberg faculty, and sometimes 2 members. They interviewed pastors and town councilmen, nobles and peasants. And now for the anticlimactic spoiler to the story. The truth is that the lofty goals of the faculty's initiatives were not consistently met. The visitors encountered many lay people who knew little about the faith they professed, and just as many pastors with only the thinnest grasp of the Bible or Lutheran theology. Luther was a visitor in one set of visitations for 3.5 months, which must have been 3.5 very long months for him, and he described what they found in his characteristically colorful way. He wrote, quote, "Dear God, what misery I beheld. The ordinary person, especially in the villages, knows absolutely nothing about the Christian teaching, and unfortunately many pastors are completely unskilled and incompetent teachers. Yet supposedly they all bear the name Christian, are baptized, and receive the Holy Sacrament, even though they do not know the Lord's Prayer, the 10 Commandments, or the Creed. As a result, they live like simple cattle or irrational pigs. And despite the fact that the gospel has returned, they have masterfully learned how to misuse all their freedom." This text, incidentally, was part of the preface to Luther's small catechism. It wasn't his most pastoral moment, let's say. He included it to explain what had compelled him to compose his own catechisms, and not surprisingly, it was usually not published with the catechism by other publishers. The lack of knowledge he witnessed about the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, and the 10 Commandments and the sacraments motivated him to write a simple, short catechism. and he lowered the goalposts by calling it a small catechism for ordinary pastors and preachers. It's a very, very small book. After a decade of effort by himself and his colleagues to train both clergy and lay in the norms of Protestant faith, he now sought simply to familiarize the clergy with the basic text of the faith in the hopes that they could pass on something of value to the parishioners. We can understand why Luther was often discouraged, and I imagine his colleagues were too. Taking the long view, though, the movement did get established. Most pastors did come to learn the Ten Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and the Creed. Preaching on the Bible became a regular Protestant practice. Universal education was achieved throughout Europe. Social welfare provisions were integrated into the norms of European society, but not in their lifetimes. By taking the long view, I mean that their initiatives were successful by about 100 to 200 years later, but they were successful. Despite the fact that this history is messier than we might want it to be, I think it's a compelling story for us here today, preparing students for service in churches that are facing a very uncertain future. We're unsure what churches will look like in 20 years or even 10. We're unsure what shapes our students' future ministries might take, or even how many shapes are possible. We're often unsure how our traditions interface with this new environment and how best to engage it. We're unsure how to train today's seminary students for tomorrow's church and how to support church leaders in the midst of these changes. I think it's helpful to remember that we're not the first generation to face an uncertain future. The history of the church, like everything else, is a history of change. I also think it's helpful to hear about the faith and works of those who have faced similar uncertainty, to be invigorated by their courage, and maybe even to retrieve and adapt some of their ideas. And I also think it's helpful to learn to see our work in the long view and not to lose hope as we take our place in the stream of human events. Thank you.